America magazine, the publication of the Jesuit order, has just published the full text of Pope Leo XIV's first formal address to the College of Cardinals. This is the 10th of May, 2025. I'll read some interesting parts from it. You can get the whole thing by going to americamagazine.org. Some of it may initially trouble you, but I want to give some balance, some reassurance that there may be no need to be troubled, and that if there is a need to be troubled, it is certainly too early in the day to have negative thoughts about this papacy, and it's a sign of a lack of charity. So let us be prudent and let us wait and watch. So diving in, the Pope said this morning, "In this regard, I would like us to renew together today our complete commitment to the path that the Universal Church has now followed for decades in the wake of the Second Vatican Council. Pope Francis masterfully and concretely set it forth in the Apostolic Exhortation Evangelii Gaudium, from which I would like to highlight several fundamental points: the return to the primacy of Christ in proclamation, the missionary conversion of the entire Christian community, growth in collegiality and synodality, attention to the sensus fidei, especially in its most authentic and inclusive forms, such as popular piety, loving care for the least and the rejected, courageous and trusting dialogue with the contemporary world in its various components and realities. These are evangelical principles that have always inspired and guided the life and activity of God's family. In these values, the merciful face of the Father has been revealed and continues to be revealed in his incarnate Son, the ultimate hope of all who sincerely seek truth, justice, peace and fraternity. Sensing myself called to continue in this same path, I chose to take the name Leo XIV. There are different reasons for this, but mainly because Pope Leo XIII, in his historic encyclical Rerum Novarum, addressed the social question in the context of the first great industrial revolution. In our own day, the Church offers to everyone the treasury of her social teaching in response to another industrial revolution and to developments in the field of artificial intelligence that pose new challenges for the defence of human dignity, justice and labour. I'll deal with the last part first, his name. Some said, it was speculation though, at the time on the day of his election, when we heard his name, that he was harking back to Leo XIII and the encyclical Rerum Novarum, and that was deduced from his work in Peru. And they seem to have hit a bullseye with that. What is also interesting though, he says there are different reasons for this, although it's mainly in relation to Leo's concern for the working man and woman. But it may be, since he says there are various reasons, that it's connected with other writings of Leo. He wrote strongly against Freemasonry. He wrote against an error called Americanism, which I'll perhaps go into another time. And he wrote about liberalism in a very, not in a friendly way to this idea that was sweeping Europe, that you can simply hold any opinions you want, and that it really doesn't matter what the rights of God are and the rights of the Church are. But going back to the principal reason for choosing the name Leo, Rerum Novarum. Now it's years since I've read it, and it's years since I read the follow-up encyclical 100 years later called Centesimus Annus by Pope John Paul II, which was, as it were, an update of Rerum Novarum, which also bears reading. I'm certainly going to go back to those in the near future. But one thing I remember particularly from Rerum Novarum is that he saw that working men and were having to engage their wives in labour in the marketplace, and sometimes the children too, because a man could not earn enough in the free market to feed himself, his wife and his children. And this was unacceptable. It was not enough that you have a free market in labour. It never is enough in practice, unless you're an absolute capitalist lunatic. That isn't, I don't mean a capitalist, I mean a capitalist lunatic who thinks there should be like free markets and everything. Well, we know they don't really believe that, don't we? Because they bail out the banks. There's some things get help, and whereas ordinary people have to suffer. But in Rerum and Bavarum it was serious because there was no welfare state in many parts of the world, or it was negligible. Germany had something going, Britain was way behind. And it meant that people would starve. But there was this problem as well, that if a man cannot go out to work and earn enough for his wife and children, then it endangers the family itself. And the church has always been careful to have the family structure in focus, because without the family structure, there can be no church. John Paul II memorably referred to the family as the domestic church. If there's no domestic church, there ain't going to be any church at all. And I think that Leo, in our day, is focused upon similar forces. They work just as brutally in different parts of the world. In our part of the world, when I say ours, I mean Great Britain, maybe the United States, Canada, Western Europe. There isn't that same brutal effect. But that may be temporary for us. Certainly, one doesn't have to be a socialist to critique capitalism. And I think a lot of people, and particularly it seems to be in America, Steve Bannon, I think today said, he may be an American Pope, but he's not America first. Well, heaven's sake, what sort of Catholic is Steve Bannon? He was an altar boy, but I think he's retained altar boy mentality, because the Pope is not to be any nation first, he's to be Christ first. And that can sometimes mean you actually butt heads with the nations and their political leaders. And I think it looks like this Pope is going to butt heads with Donald Trump. That's the way it goes. Let me tell you, it's not unusual. It's quite a sign of a healthy Christendom. Well, we don't have a healthy Christendom, but it itself is a sign that Christendom is healthy. In the great ages of faith, we had, for example, Henry IV, who was to be the Holy Roman Emperor. He was king of the Germans. He's sought to excommunicate the great Hildebrand, Gregory VII. And there was a tussle between the two. And eventually, Henry submitted and went effectively on his knees to Canossa, where the Pope was at the time in northern Italy, and begged forgiveness. So conflict's normal. In Britain, in England, we had the conflict between King John, King John of Robin Hood and his merry men, and Friar Tuck. King John was placed, he so displeased the Pope Innocent III, and Innocent III was a mighty man, a mighty Pope, that the Holy Father placed the whole of England under interdict. And that meant there could be no masses, no other sacraments. Maybe they could have the sacraments, the last rites, sacraments of extreme unction, I don't know, but it was a real problem. And the problem is not just a religious one, because when the Holy Father withdraws the Church's support from a monarch, there are wolves around, other aspiring claimants to the throne, and so things can get a bit difficult. And I think King John saw that risk, and Henry IV experienced that risk. He was very much weakened by his conflict with the Pope. So those were those days. So what's going to happen between the likes of Trump and Pope Leo? Don't worry about it. It's going to be like tiny compared to what happened in the past. And I've just gave you two examples of explosions between the secular power and the spiritual power. The Pope is right to mention issues arising in the field of artificial intelligence, but I think he may be jumping like a kangaroo over another issue which is present today, Why is Peru, his beloved adopted country, poor? Why is much of South America poor, much of Africa poor, many European people poor, many Americans in the richest country in the world having no healthcare, having huge debts from simply going to university, and ordinary Americans just scraping by. Same this side of the Atlantic, but we have a better welfare state. But still, with the abundance of wealth and how much it has increased since I was a lad, and yet ordinary people may have more toys, with no mobile phones in the 1970s when we went to school, but people are not as rich as some other people have got. You know the story, the top 1%. Now, it isn't about envy. Say, for example, you have a mortgage, or you had a mortgage which you've now paid off. You borrowed a certain amount of money, but your bank invented on its books. Yes, that's true. Money doesn't come from a vault. They just make it up. They invent it. They lend it to you. You buy the house and you pay back about 2.5 times the amount. It's therefore very hard for a man to go out to work and on his wage pay a mortgage and feed his family. So the wife has to go out to work. They delay having children because of the cost of children, because everything is absorbed in housing costs. So you see then, the very thing that Pope Leo XIII was worried about over 100 years ago is a problem that remains with us. And I was talking about Westerners, talking about people in the developed world. You know how horrible it must be for people getting by in Peru, of which Leo knows everything, and other parts of the world. What am I getting at? One word, usury. I've mentioned it in all the videos. Usury, though, is important. This is not socialism I'm talking here. I'm talking about finance capital. Industrial capital has its problems. And you can read about 19th century England if you want to see what it was like for ordinary people in the mightiest, most advanced nation in the world at that time. Not good, not pretty. Suicides followed because of the sheer misery of people then. But what we have to understand is that usury sucks up the social product and places it in the hands of a small number. And that is why the Catholic Church, let me underline this, the Catholic Church does not just teach about the nature of God and the sacraments, it taught that usury, that is, interest being taken on loans, was forbidden, was a mortal sin. In fact, it had to be confessed if you did it. And this was through most of the Church's 2,000-year history. A chink to allow this was made in the battlements. In 1555, I think it was, when Pope Leo X allowed this for banks called the Montes Pietatis, the Mountains of Pity, to allow these charitable banks to lend to the poor. But it's like a very big wedge, and the thin end of it was pushed to open a hole in the wall, and then the wedge has been hammered in ever since, so that nobody speaks about usury now. But there must be a reason why it was condemned by the Holy Catholic Church for 1,500 years in absolute terms, and then still formally condemned today, just with a whimper rather than a shout. This is destroying family life all over the world, so we have to look to things like Rerum Novarum as our encyclicals about us, even though they were set in a setting over 100 years old. Thus we can see the great relevance of this Pope taking the name of the great Leo XIII. I just want to underline to people, especially American people, because I think the word communism and socialism has been a bogeyman, or you'd call a boogeyman, to keep you awake at night in the dark, fearful, so you don't focus on who's actually ripping you off. Well, it isn't that you have to become a communist or a socialist just because you see the errors of the system we have. You just have to be a Catholic. Me, left and right don't mean a great deal. Those are terms from the French Revolution, in the National Assembly when you had La Montagne, the mountain, the deputies, most of them, and on the left were those who wanted the king's head and an even more radical revolution, and on their right were those who wanted to take the revolution in a more mild fashion, those who wanted to have, say, a constitutional monarchy, English style perhaps. But I'm pre that. I'd call myself a reactionary, if anything. You don't have to fit yourself into the moulds that modern 20th and 21st century politics puts you if you're a Catholic. You can break out of those. You follow our own way, a truly Catholic way. So now we can look at what I'd characterise as a kind of outline of a manifesto for this pontificate. He says, I'd like us to renew together today our complete commitment to the path that the Universal Church has now followed for decades in the wake of the Second Vatican Council. Now that's going to be sending a shiver down the spines of traditionalists. I understand that. The idea. He wants us to renew a complete commitment to the path the Church has followed since the Second Vatican Council. You might think, my gosh, haven't we had enough already? Well, I think those are words, and the council's happened. It isn't going to be disavowed. The documents that have been produced at the time and since then are not going to be cancelled. We just have to see what happens in practice. So the Pope goes on to say, Pope Francis masterfully and concretely set it forth in the Apostolic Exhortation Evangelii Gaudium, from which I would like to highlight several fundamental points. So these are the fundamental points that this Pope is focused on. I think most of them are excellent, just brilliant. The return to the primacy of Christ in proclamation. Couldn't agree more. That's what the founder of this church 2,000 years ago would want. He is prime. Oh, the Pope isn't therefore negating the Blessed Mother because, as we saw on the balcony at his inauguration, at his election, he led us in a Hail Mary. I don't think there's going to be any marginalising of the Blessed Mother, but of course you can't understand the Blessed Mother without first understanding Christ. What does slightly kind of make me puzzled is, if he's saying the return to the primacy of Christ in proclamation, when was Christ not primary in the proclamation in the Catholic Church for 2,000 years? I don't know. There's a mystery. But nonetheless, putting the past aside, if we're going to have a massive proclamation of Christ, that will work wonders. Next thing. The missionary conversion of the entire Christian community. That can only refer to the Catholic community because the Pope has no administrative authority over anybody outside the Catholic Church. So we are the entire Christian community in this case. Sure, it'd be great if the Protestants would convert en masse, but that's not the primary concern. In fact, we know we've got problems because, most American Catholics, and I don't know, I'm sure it's the same over here on our side of the Atlantic, but I don't think they do the surveys here that they do in the USA. Most American Catholics don't believe that when they go to Mass and the priest elevates the host, that we have the actual body and blood of Christ there, soul and divinity. But evangelical Protestantism is the most conservative form of Protestantism, and most of them, in a survey I read today, do not believe that Christ is God. They believe he's created. They're Arians or Jehovah's Witness types. So we all have our issues with our contemporary generation. So the missionary conversion of the entire Christian, that is Catholic, community. We do need conversion because that example of the Eucharist is just one of many. If we can convert the Catholic people, 1.4 billion souls, then we can convert the world once they're converted. In fact, we'd only probably need to convert about 10%. You know? And 100 million Catholics, say, fired up for the gospel, could convert the world. So this is really, really important for missionary work outward. The conversion of ourselves, our own people first, is necessary. So I can't see anything wrong with that, and that's a brilliant focus. Then there's something, though, which he says, which is probably going to give people a bit of the collywobbles. Growth in collegiality and synodality. I think, oh, by gum, that again, is that still going on then? So Francis is not resting in his tomb without the ghost of his thoughts rising up. You know something, though? There's nothing wrong, in principle, with collegiality and synodality. Those of us who observed over the decades the heretical teachings from various parts of the world looked to, say, John Paul II as the guardian of orthodoxy. And then Benedict as the continuation of that. Even though, if you look at it closely, you can't say that this was actually going in the way it should go. After all, the Assisi event was not established by the German bishops, was it? The visiting of mosques and synagogues and appearing to pray in them was not done by the Dutch bishops. Well, he may have done it, but it didn't matter. These innovations really come from the centre. And we have to understand that we can no longer say that Rome is the bulwark against heresy to which we must look for shelter. It unfortunately is no longer the case. So in that set of circumstances in which we find ourselves, we mustn't fret too much about talk of collegiality and synodality. But you might say, well, it will make things worse. Those lunatics in Germany shouldn't have a big say in how the church is run. At least in Rome, there's some brakes on the whole process of decline. It may be a fair point. It just means that we'll get to hell more slowly if we don't have collegiality and synodality, but we will get to hell. Here's what is needed. That missionary conversion of the entire Christian community must happen. If it doesn't, everything's going to hell in a handcart, as the Americans say. Everything. Whether there's a central authority, which is crumbling now in its orthodoxy, as we've seen in recent decades, or whether we have a decentralised church. In fact, we mustn't be against collegiality and synodality in principle, because look at the councils we had. We had several councils in the early centuries, not just in Rome, and I'm not just talking about the great ecumenical councils either, regional councils like Elvira, for example, where very important decisions were taken, where you could speak of orthodoxy being upheld. Why? Because the church, the Catholic Church, was an orthodox people at large across the earth. Didn't matter where you held a council. You had an orthodox people. Collegiality that would be fine. Why shouldn't you have a feeding in from the various Catholic regions to the Mother Church at Rome? It couldn't be anything but good. Our Bible. We have the Pope, St. Damasus I, the Synod of Rome in 382, synodality there, gives us a list of all the books of the Bible. But independently, in 393, across the Mediterranean Sea in North Africa, St. Augustine heads the Council of Hippo Regius, which affirms the books of the Bible as well. 397 AD, at Carthage, presided over again by St. Augustine, who was never a pope, who was just a bishop. We have, again, affirmation of the books of the Bible. And these decisions are sent to Rome for validation. But you see the work of local synods, how important it was. That's how it should be, and that's how it would be in a healthy church. That's what synodality and collegiality would be about. They'll be failing if we have a church that's full of heretics, Catholic apostates. But if the church is full of Catholic apostates, Rome will fail as well. We're just at that stage. We can see it's not a matter of philosophical reasoning. We observe it. Now here's something which I think can be very, very interesting. Attention to the sensus fidei, especially in its most authentic and inclusive forms. Oops, that word inclusive makes one nervous, but no. It says, in its most authentic and inclusive forms, such as popular piety. Well, that's really interesting, because popular piety is the pilgrimages, the devotions to Mary, the Rosary, the Divine Mercy, all these things. But we can also say, when we're speaking of the sensus fidei, the great desire of lay Catholics in large numbers to have the traditional Latin Mass. If this Pope has drawn out this phrase, attention to the sensus fidei, then it's logical, it seems to me, that he will give a broad opening to the people's wish to have the traditional Latin Mass, and to have much of our patrimony brought back, which was exiled after the council, which closed in 1965. So there's great hope in that point that the Pope has raised. Then the Pope spoke of loving care for the least and the rejected. Who could argue with that? I can't remember what saint it was. It was St. Martin, who was asked by some pagans to bring the treasures of the church to them. And he said, I can do that. They wanted wealth, they wanted to see the money all the church had. And he brought a load of beggars and disabled people. And he said, here are the treasures of the church. That's about the 4th century AD. But I can be corrected on that, I forget. But you see, this loving care for the least and the rejected is what caused the church to explode across the world in numbers. It was simply something that pagans never did. It is something that makes the Catholic Church the biggest charitable organisation on earth outside of the United States of America. USA is number one because it's sheer wealth and power. But given what USAID has been up to, you don't know whether it's really been doing charitable work. But the Catholic Church, putting that country to one side, is the greatest charitable organisation on earth. It's basically in the DNA. It's from Christ himself, of course. So when the Pope speaks of that, that cannot be objected to. Of course, if somebody says, when you mean the least and the rejected, maybe you mean certain groups who are regarded as marginalised. Well, one has to see what is meant by least and rejected, but in its traditional sense, no arguments. This is why we're at early days, and we have to see what in concrete ways this, as I say, putative manifesto really makes of itself in concrete terms. Finally, he draws from Francis's Evangelii Gaudium. Courageous and trusting dialogue with the contemporary world in its various components and realities. That's a bit of a mouthful, let me just repeat it. Courageous and trusting dialogue with the contemporary world in its various components and realities. Who knows what that means? On the face of it, again, seems no problem. But it is the one that you might think is going to be the drive the coach and horses through the Catholic faith yet again, the Catholic moral teaching. Because what are those various components and realities of the contemporary world? But let's start with the word dialogue. Courageous and trusting dialogue. Well, what's wrong with that? Somebody's there, we chat with them. Perfectly fine. Should be perfectly fine. The problem with dialogue that seemed to take place over the period since the Second Vatican Council is it's not saying, hello, how are you? Here's what I believe. What do you believe? Oh, let's see what we've got in common and let's see where we differ. And then once we've had the dialogue, here's why we think you should really consider what we believe to be true. Rather than doing that, it's like, oh, what do you believe? Let's see what we can incorporate of what you believe in what we believe, thus corrupting our faith. It's really like, rather than dialogue, it becomes a negotiation, as if we want to come to a middle ground with our interlocutors. And in the process, we surrender something and they surrender something, but the fact is they never surrender anything, and we should never be surrendering anything. That's what makes dialogue, as it's happened in practice, suspicious. We just don't know whether it's going to be dialogue in that way that's going to proceed, continue to proceed, or it's going to be dialogue in the proper way. Okay, dialogue with the world, modern world, in its aspects. Well, we know what the contemporary world is. The contemporary world belongs to Satan. What can we say that is good in the contemporary world that was not present in the prior world that we have now? Well, it's hard to find anything. There's been no moral upward movement. You might say, okay, there's been the abolition of slavery in the 19th century. There's the laws against racial discrimination in the 20th century. Laws against discrimination against women in the same century. You can speak of those things, but I'm not sure that we can say that really amounts to much when we've got the contemporary world facing us of abortion, of the rainbow phenomenon, the rainbow ideology or ideologies, the anti-Christian advance, the hostility to Christianity, the blasphemy of Christianity, the movies, the films, the newspapers, the magazines, all assaulting Christianity, all corrupting morals. The social welfare net, which in Britain could have been a brilliant thing if it had been kept to what Lord Beveridge proposed in 1944. If you're not British, you won't know about this, and if you're British, you probably don't know about it either. But the welfare state was meant to be an extremely, a true safety net, but a thin one and a limited one, because Lord Beveridge saw the disincentives that might arise from a welfare state that was too generous. But nonetheless, that was a good thing in itself, but now we have a monster. A monster which I'm not talking about people getting lazy and not going to work. No, I'm talking about how it's harder to, if you've got massive taxes to fund this welfare state, then again, a man cannot go out and on a single wage bring his money home without it being taxed to pay for him, his wife and the kids and pay for a mortgage. So that's one problem in itself. But separately from that, if it's easy for a young woman to have a baby and to be supported by the state so that it becomes her husband, then it's less likely that couples will form bonds, because marriage, despite what the fairy stories say, is not just about love and romance. It's about an economic unit, a social security unit. So if the social security element of the family is taken away, you've removed a major buttress to the family as an institution. And sadly, this can only go on for so long. At some point, the welfare state will collapse, but the family will have been collapsed already by the welfare state, or it'll be one of the causes of the collapse of the family. So what on earth society will be then, only heaven knows. So contemporary society, while it gives us some things, and of course these rights of women, of course women should have rights, but then there's a disincentive for men to even marry, because they lose their children, they may lose their house. Maybe they should if they beat their wife and all this kind of stuff. But still, huge numbers of men are looking at the situation and are concerned what will happen to them if the marriage goes down. And all marriages go down at some point. They just give it time and they'll go up again. I think marriage is maybe like the stock market. That's just my image coming to my mind. So the welfare state's a real problem. Rights of women, good and a bad. And so we can't say that even the best things we can point to in contemporary society have given us something that we should think wonderful things about. And the bad things of our society, they are truly dark, abysmal, darker than anything's ever been in Western civilization since before Christianity came, before the monks came and civilized the tribes that lived here. So then we must ask, we're going to dialogue with this contemporary world in its various components and realities. Are we going to do the kind of dialogue I outlined earlier, where we negotiate to be more acceptable to them, so we make concessions to them? If it's that, if we're continuing down that road, we have a model for that. It's called the Anglican Church. The Anglican Church is the national church of England, and it's utterly irrelevant. And it's a terrible shame. I would actually like there to be, in my country, a strong and powerful Anglican Church and bishops in the House of Lords being strong and powerful, because they could have prevented a lot of the evils that have come to England because of their weakness. But wishes. It's like wishing for the tooth fairy, isn't it? The Anglican Church is a man-made church. It could never achieve anything. None of these man-made Protestant churches can. Even the enthusiastic evangelicals of America have achieved very little. But if we are going to not say to the contemporary world, you are wrong in this way, if we're not going to challenge them like Christ. You know what Christ said on moral matters? If a man, take a married man, he looks at a woman lustfully, he's already committed adultery in his heart. Well, the penalty for adultery was stoning to death. It was taken really seriously back then. We can't really get a grip on how serious it was in our society because it's so common. It's not punished. Yeah, it's not, but maybe it should be punished. There's an idea, isn't it? But there we are. It's not punished. It's not taken seriously. And it's about following your heart. That's the big thing. By the way, there's a film called Brief Encounter. Celia Johnson and Trevor Howard, 1946. Remade in 1975 with Richard Burton and Sophie Loren. And they had a spark. They met by accident at a train station. They had a spark, but she didn't go with him. She went back to her husband, whom I don't think she necessarily loved, because that was her husband. You see, that could not have been invented in 1975. That had to be a remake of a 1946 film, when British morals were much more solid. Jesus tells us, as I've said, just by looking at a woman lustfully, you've committed adultery in your heart. So I suppose Trevor Howard and Richard Burton, they both had committed adultery in their characters by lusting after Celia Johnson and, in 75, Sophie Loren. Why I'm mentioning this is because Jesus is very severe morally. He's not into free love. Surprise, surprise. He's not into what used to be called in Britain the permissive society. So how on earth can the rainbow people and the rainbow bishops think for a minute that any of their shenanigans, any of their negotiations over these shenanigans, any of their attempts to accommodate to these shenanigans is acceptable to God and not making him furious? You see, the talk of the wrath of God in the Bible is it's anthropomorphizing, projecting human qualities onto God, because we can't understand God really in any other way. But when it comes to Jesus, that is, the second person takes a human nature, that anger is expressed actually in human terms. He was angry on the earth with certain things, and he'll be angry in heaven right now with those Catholic bishops. And if our new Pope goes down the same road that has been travelled right until the present, then Christ's anger will be upon him too. It's unavoidable. It's in the Gospels. So, a mild word of advice to the new Holy Father. Hopefully, he isn't even thinking about that. Hopefully, he's thinking the church has been travelling on a road for 2,000 years. It kind of went into the air, slightly off the road for a few years, and I'm going to put it back on the road that it's always been on. This has just been a slight detour, and that's all. Hopefully it's just that. As I say, we cannot know what he pours into these generalizations that I've described, that I've quoted from Francis's apostolic exhortation. We can only hope that they are the very ideas that will render the church a faithful church in its leadership once again. Now it's a matter of waiting and seeing.